Like we're about ready to start. So welcome. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kendall Phillips. I'm a professor of communication and rhetorical studies and co-director of the Lender Center for Social Justice here at Syracuse University. And I'm honored to welcome you to this year's Lender Conversation. I want to begin by acknowledging with respect the Onondaga Nation, Fire Keepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose lands Syracuse now stands. The Lender Conversation is an annual event designed to facilitate public conversations about pressing issues related to social justice. Previous conversations have focused on issues of how we can relate to difficult memories from our nation's past. And last year's theme focused on policed bodies, a conversation about race, disability, and justice. This year's Lender Conversation engages the idea of creative activity as a human right, a theme that will be featured throughout our sessions today. I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the School of Education, Hendricks Chapel, and the Humanities Center here at Syracuse University. And I also want to acknowledge the invisible labor of those who have worked incredibly hard behind the scenes to bring this event together for you today. Our amazing graduate assistant, Evan Davis, the fine folks working with visual technologies and Syracuse University's learning environments and media production, the amazing people at the university's communication and marketing teams, and the staff of the School of Education. I also want to acknowledge the ongoing support, guidance, and friendship of the Lender family, whose generosity and inspiration have made this event and indeed the center possible. It's my pleasure now to introduce you for a brief word of welcome from our friends, Helene and Marvin Lender.
Yes, sorry, thank you.
Start the video, right there.
You see, my wife is telling me exactly what to do, which hasn't changed for 57 years. So thanks so much, Kendall, for that introduction. And it's really us who want to thank all of you for the work that you're doing at the Lender Center for Social Justice. Kendall has been joined by James, and this is his program today, and we're very much appreciative of the quality of people, including Evan, and I could go on and on and on. The current support of the new dean or the acting dean at the school, Kelly, is really much appreciated, as well as the new provost, who recognizes and is trying to help us even further develop what it is that we have been doing, which I think has been successful to date. When Helene and I conceived of the Lender Center for Social Justice, I thought the country and the world was at its worst, and that we had to do something, and this really gives us an opportunity to contribute in some way. Well, things have since, not because of the Lender Center, have deteriorated. And I really believe it's more important now than ever that we do the work that we are doing it, and we do it at Syracuse University, which can become the depository for all of the research that's been done to date and further research that will be done in the future. Today's program is really reflective of the kinds of conversations that we can have. The ones we've had in the past have been super successful, and I suspect today's will be as well. So I'll just end by saying what I started saying, and that is thank you to all of you for helping to make this center the success that it is, and I know it will be. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Marvin, for those kind words. Thank you, Helene, for keeping Marvin in line. We're always appreciative of the dynamic duo.
I didn't even have to kick him. He said exactly what I told him to say.
You can see the partnership here. We've been very generous, great collaborators for us. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you my friend and partner, Dr. James Haywood Rowling, Jr. Dr. Rowling is a professor and program coordinator for arts education in the School of Art and the School of Education here at Syracuse University. He is a renowned arts practitioner and theorist, and author of numerous books, including Swarm Intelligence, Arts-Based Research, and Growing Up Ugly, Memoirs of a Black Boy Daydreaming. He currently He serves as the 37th president of the National Arts Education Association and as the co-director for the Lender Center of Social Justice. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Dr. Rowland.
Thanks so much, Kendall and Marvin and Helene and everyone in the audience for your time and your attention for the proceedings for the day. I have been given the task of doing two things, expressing an overview of why we're having this event today, and also of introducing our keynote speaker for the day, Dr. Emilia Cray. Let me get to the first things first. It's an interesting task to condense everything that I've been thinking about for the past few years into a few minutes, which is really the purpose of today's, to get at the purpose of today's Lender-Centered conversation. But I'll preface it this way. When I was a young student at the High School of Art and Design in New York City, I sometimes chose to give my art away. It's important to note how out of character this was for me, because I'm a methodical art maker and I invest a lot of time in my work. And to this day, I'm quite content if my work stays in my studio and surrounds me. I've rarely even sold my art. So for me to give something that I made away, it had to strike me that someone else needed it more than I did. Now, the difference between a need and a right is that a need describes the conditions required for a human being to thrive. A right, however, is the recognition of any individual's entitlement simply by virtue of being a human to have that need fulfilled. And of course, the title of our event today is Creative Activity as a Human Right. So what is the need that the arts, design, and our scientific innovations and all that our creative activities fulfill? In fact, all of these things, I would argue, the arts, design, our scientific innovations actually serve the same function: to organize and model all that we know so that we can grow. It's actually, I think, a mistake to compartmentalize them. I've argued that the need is fundamental. The need for all of these things, the arts, design, scientific innovation, the need is growth. The need is human development, contributing to the collective story and the advancement of our network of cultures and civilizations. Yet, as Marvin Lender just intimated, look at us today. In the midst of our worst global health crisis, the worst that we've probably ever lived through, yet still polarized and divided and self-centered and uncooperative and distracted by our entertainments and shrinking from the great opportunities at hand to make changes with the potential to halt multiple global environmental and social crises as we chase after misinformation and conspiracy theories. But I learned early on as an elementary school art teacher that no one makes the next creative leap unless they first recognize their right and capacity to make change and have access to the creative avenues and materials that will make those changes visible and material, manifesting their growth in capacity and knowledge, not only for themselves, but for others to build upon. And so I've called us together today to ask these questions. What if the right to signify one's life as a life that matters and to model one's life experience and perceptions to others and to contest prevailing norms through our creative acts was understood as a basic human right? And what if one's creative activity is neither one's personal property nor one's private advantage, but is intended to fuel society's next creative leap? And what if, rather than competing merely to dominate our neighbors and secure our personal liberties in a contest for the survival of the fittest, we instead competed in the far greater contest for the survival of the patterns and stories that sustain our better selves? In other words, if the need of every human being is to grow for as long as growth is possible, it is also the right of every human being to have access to the same storehouses of creative activity that have proven over and over again to be catalysts for growth and human development in every civilization, across all geographies and eras, and in the wake of even our worst traumas, our most unexpected catastrophes, or our worst inhumanities against one another. There is a reason why defenders of the status quo and what I like to call anti-change inactivists always seek to crush not only activism for change, but also the belief that change is possible. And even more than that, to crush the capacity to be creative and to think otherwise. So today's lender-centered conversation is dedicated to thinking otherwise. And so we'll begin. Now, at this point, it's truly my honor to introduce Dr. Emilia Cray. She is Associate Vice President for Equity in the Arts at the University of Arizona and the co-founder and co-director of Racial Justice Studio. I've known Dr. Cray, or Amy, as her friends know her, and I'm blessed to call her my friend. I've known her as a professional colleague since spring 2013, when I was selected by junior faculty members at the University of North Texas to aid them in their early career planning as a part of a new faculty mentoring program that was established at that point in time. Dr. Cray's potential was immediately apparent to me, immediately evident, both as her potential as a scholar and as a mentor to others. In early edited volumes such as Intersectionality in Urban Education, The Education of Black Males in a Post-Racial World. But it was her work as co-editor of the 2018 publication of the Palgrave Handbook of Race in the Arts and Education that shifted her from the ranks of the ministering choir to lead singer. The Palgrave Handbook of Race in the Arts and Education was authored as a singular and timely response to the persistent silences and omissions about race and racial justice in and throughout the arts and education, media, and society. When I was senior editor of Art Education, the flagship journal of the National Art Education Association, I called upon Amy's voice of clarity when I invited her to guest edit the July 2017 special issue on the theme of creative activity as a human right that has led to our lender conversation for today. And there's no surprise, by the way, that Dr. Cray went on to succeed me as the senior editor of Art Education. Widely recognized at this point in her career for her ongoing research on arts equity and her many publications, workshops, podcasts, and lectures, illuminating the role that race, racism, and anti-racism play in and through the arts. Amy's newest book, Race and Art Education, was just published in August 2021. I'm proud that Amy has chosen to be with us this afternoon to jumpstart today's conversations with our highly anticipated keynote presentation titled Joy, Justice, and Creative Futures. Please welcome her.
I need a little help starting my video. I think it's being blocked. There we go. Thanks so much, whoever did that. That was magical. And thank you, James, for that beautiful introduction. It is my pleasure to be here today with all of you. I want to thank James as well as Kendall for inviting me to share remarks at this year's Lender Center conversation on the theme of creative activity as a human right. It's a real honor. My talk today is titled Joy, Justice, and Creative Futures. I will share my screen, if you'll give me just a moment. There we are. I would like to begin by addressing the context in which we are living. The three pandemics we are living through. COVID-19, brought on by coronavirus, global warming, brought on by unsustainable development, and racism, born of white supremacist colonialist systems, have brought about enormous hardship and losses. There we are. The loss of individual lives, livelihoods, and ways of life. To be sure, pardon me, James, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my screen is flickering on and off. And I'm not able to speak with you when it does that. Okay, we'll see if it clears up. My apologies.
No worries.
So for many of us working in the continuum of K through 20 art education, which includes elementary and secondary art teachers and post-secondary art educators, I think the pandemic revealed the inadequacies of the globally interconnected economic system that prioritizes profits over people and the planet. The consequences of that disregard are high, and they set off an alarm, waking up many art educators and others. Crises are also events that create opportunities to see the world differently. They jar us from common sense thinking and pry open a space in which to imagine and create a future that might just be better than the past or the present. I believe artists, educators, and activists, like all of us here, are in the creative futures business. And what I mean by this is we play important roles in helping other people to imagine new ways of living and to dream of a more just and joyful future for more people. This is what I am thinking about when I hear the phrase creative activity as a human right. What is demanded of arts and arts education in times like this, where there is enormous instability and precarity? This is a question that many art educators are asking themselves as they formulate all kinds of contingencies for the weeks and months that lie ahead in the 2021-22 school year, while also trying to overcome their own exhaustion from the toll of the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, many racialized people working for social justice also contend with racial battle fatigue. Racial battle fatigue is a term used to describe the cumulative stress caused by seeing images of Black death and anti-Asian violence, seeing little attention given to missing Indigenous women in the US, and it describes the cumulative harm of experiencing racial insults, slights, and other microaggressions, as when Latinx people are harassed for speaking Spanish, and the police are called on Black people for being Black while sitting in a Starbucks, being Black while bird watching in the park, or being Black while simply going about their day. Add atop that, the additional burden of helping to educate potential allies. Art education scholar Joni Acuff, who is a longtime friend and collaborator of mine, has written eloquently about her own racial battle fatigue. She says it can cause individuals to lose confidence in themselves and question their life's work. I'll quote from a passage that she wrote. Black female educator, heel toe clack tap, tap heel toe clap tap tap, chasse chasse I go, gliding around the classroom, teaching the day's lesson. I find myself performing a tap dance, moving to the rhythm of a fast hi-hat. My performance is an entertaining one. It is believable and energetic. However, underneath, I am angry. I am cringing, and I could scream until my throat bleeds. My stomach is in knots and my heart is aching and heavy with the weight of what it means to be Black in America today. Death, probable death. Yesterday, I watched video footage of another white police officer murder another Black man. No, a Black child this time, a 12-year-old boy. When I enter the classroom today, I am tired. In every way, I am mourning. I am experiencing emotional and psychological trauma, and I have had no time, less than 24 hours, to recover. My homogeneous classroom of all white students makes my Blackness even louder. It is an awkward noise that only I can hear. Yet I smile and I laugh and I teach. Racial battle fatigue also produces psychological effects like suppressed immunity, tension headaches, trembling and jumpiness, chronic pain and healed or healing injuries. and elevated blood pressure. When anticipating racial conflict, non-white people also have described bouts of frequent urination, uncontrollable sweating, anxiety, insomnia, and conflict-specific dreams, as well as rapid mood swings and even social withdrawal. There is also exhaustion from protests and cynicism that little has changed since the racial uprisings of 2020, despite George Floyd's murder and subsequent calls for anti-racism and anti-bias teaching in schools and workplaces. Now, K through 12 teachers have been targeted for intimidation. Last May, art teacher Kayla Mick, who teaches at Downing Middle School in Flower Mound, Texas, was placed on administrative leave. It was a response to some parents disapproving of the artwork featured on the back of this yearbook, which was decided on by the 8th grade students. Pictured here, it features various phrases: Black Lives Matter, I can't breathe, love is love, and others related to human rights and major events that occurred in the past year. The school's principal gave families the option to request an alternate cover for their yearbook, effectively censoring students' speech. Since then, the backlash against any discussions of race and racism in schools have grown more violent. On October 4th, just last month, the US Department of Justice reported a concern over the notable increases in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence against school board members, teachers, and workers in the nation's public schools. Battles over diversity and equity initiatives in public schools have resulted in administrators and teachers being fired or resigning over discussions about equity, diversity, and inclusion. Having started his career as a music teacher, veteran educator Rydell Harrison started a new position as a school superintendent in Southwestern Connecticut in August of 2020. After being excited to join a community that he said was committed to diversity and equity and was looking for his leadership for its schools, he endured the kind of vitriol that has become widespread at school board meetings and in social media. Just 10 months into his position, he resigned, stating, quote, "People have asked me, was it one flyer too many? And it wasn't just this one thing. It was the collection of all these pieces and the emotional and personal toll to be a Black man doing this work and facing very blatant attacks left and right," end quote. So exhaustion seems somehow inadequate to describe the emotional toll of being targeted by right-wing groups. And it's not just this year. Since 2016, in the election of President Donald Trump, there was an uptick at that point and has continued in the number of faculty at universities reporting that they too have been the subjects of harassment and intimidation by organizations and individuals espousing views consistent with ideologies of the alt-right, neo-fascism, and global white supremacy. Much of the documented harassment takes place in public spaces. It's often online, in tabloid news sites, and in social media. But attacks can also be personalized and strike closer to home. In July of 2018, the book I co-edited with Ruben Gastambide Fernandez and Steve Carpenter, which James highlighted in his introduction, titled The Palgrave Handbook of Race and the Arts in Education, was published. And in it was an essay by a friend and a colleague of mine, educational philosopher Tyson Lewis, asking art teachers to reflect on the nature of whiteness. That publication was the impetus for the harassment and violent speech Tyson endured for months and months to come. We wrote about the incident in an article titled Rise, Emergent Strategies for Reclaiming Joy and Agency Against Neo-Fascist and White Supremacist Assaultive Speech. I'd like to share a short passage from it. It's a portion that Tyson wrote that captures what it feels like to undergo an assault. I had not imagined the swell of messages that would suddenly fill my inbox. one after another, of misinformed, derogatory, and hate-filled messages calling me any number of racist and homophobic names and slandering my work flooded my university email account. Suddenly, my body felt hot, my mouth dry, and my heart was pounding so loudly that I thought it would leap out of my chest cavity. The whole thing felt like an invasion, leaving me in a precarious and vulnerable position. Immediately, I wanted to reach out and tell someone what was happening, but I was unsure whom to contact. The feeling was coupled with an equally powerful sense of being frozen, clicking through each email, unable not to read the slander and the vulgarities. The cascade of messages hypnotized me. Then my phone rang. It was the chair of my department, offering a warning that I might need to prepare myself for an attack by right-wing watchdog groups. As I listened to her, I looked out my window, wondering whether or not my private address was posted on the university website. Shock, confusion, anger, vulnerability, fatigue, paranoia, these are some of the words that have become prominent in the last several years. And yet they seem inadequate to describe the emotional toll of being targeted with hate speech. Assaults like this are becoming rather typical, particularly for women academics, minoritized professors, and those whose writing deals critically with racism and other forms of social injustice. As graduate students, neither Tyson nor I recalled being mentored in ways that alerted or prepared us for the kind of intimidation he would encounter, and I would try to help him work through as a friend and as a member of an academic community that still values academic freedom. It is likely that few of us here today have been prepared for the rise in the number of attacks against academics, as well as teachers, deemed to be threats to conservative values. And there are some practical tips to be found on a few blogs here and there that might be useful, but by and large, few of us are prepared. So in writing about that incident together, it became clear to Tyson and me how these attacks are attacks against joy. The personalization of the attacks, coupled with their intensity and the ferocity, intentionally isolate individuals, producing sensations of precarious and vulnerable flesh. The burden of carrying the weight of these attacks, especially when they're sustained for months, if not years, increases the risks of eventual burnout. Among artists, educators, and activists, the fight against burnout is therefore a fight for safeguarding the joy in seeking justice on the level of the flesh, of the body. As political theorists, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri define it, quote, "The path of joy is constantly to open new possibilities, to expand our field of imagination, our abilities to feel and be affected, our capacities for action and passion," end quote. In other words, joy is the sensation of an increase in the power to act and to think that comes from an encounter with others. Assaultive speech is precisely an attempt to replace joy with affects of fear, paranoia, and hate. To make sense of any traumatic event and reestablish a feeling of safety and a way forward involves substantial labor. Ridding oneself of toxic affect requires being in solidarity with others. Even the seemingly simple act of sharing one's story allows others to help join in lifting the weight of trauma that is difficult for any one body to carry alone. In other words, self-care and restoration of joy can be reframed as creative, collaborative activity. And our writing together about that episode is one example of that. So within this context, I have been thinking a lot about social justice as world making. It involves imagining and materializing a future that is better, more joyful, equitable, and sustainable than the present. Such a future requires an inclusive vision of the good life. Yet there are few spaces that invite visioning and experimentation in world making. In much of contemporary life, the social imagination must contend with a hyperbolic media landscape in which tropes of justice serve as kindling for fear, pessimism, and violence. In search of an antidote, I think it important to explore joy and justice as part of the creative work of imagining, designing, prototyping, writing, and rehearsing the world anew. If it's all right with you, I'd like to start this exploration with some ruminations based upon my own observations and experiences teaching in and studying the creative environment of art classrooms. My thoughts are provoked by the question, is the art classroom a space for joy? In schools, don't worry, be happy, might well characterize the ethos and expectations of an art class. Just looking at this slide, this is a slide with a few images from a quick Google search I did with the words art class fun. You see how many results there are. There are institutional and societal reasons for this strong connection between art class and the idea of fun. First is the institutional explanation. The arts are often seen as less intellectually demanding than academic subjects like English, math, or science. Art class is often thought of as enrichment time or time for fun, a break in the school day that is otherwise filled with rigorous study. As art education historian Arthur Eflin once argued, school arts serve a hidden social function to, quote, vivify school life and break up the deadening routine, end quote. Art education scholar Beth Link suggests that, quote, the latent role of the arts in schools is to provide a therapeutic outlet for students stifled by the violence of traditional education. And this demand for the arts to function as therapy creates tension as art educators are dissuaded from tackling more challenging conceptual material, end quote. The desire to shelter and protect children from political, social, and cultural issues comes from adults' presumption that children are innocent, vulnerable, and incompetent. The societal explanation builds from there. Again, drawing from Arthur Eflin, the arts in schools help to, quote, socialize the individual into accepting the authority of the school as a prelude for accepting the authority of other social institutions, end quote. Other institutions being the government, medicine, corporations, the military. If art education and art in schools is associated with taking a break from harder work of academic subjects, the action tendency would be to reach for creative projects that are fun, not really challenging. And there's nothing inherently wrong with fun. For the record, I am pro fun, but fun is not what most people think of when dealing with grand challenges and weighty subjects like environmental disaster and humanitarian crises wrought by climate change or racial justice for Black and Brown people. In fact, many teachers might want to avoid discussions of race and racism out of fear that students' feelings, in particular anger and rage, might erupt and spill out into the classroom. This spillage is unpredictable, it's uncontainable, it's unmanageable. This negative perception of anger is often guided by a misunderstanding of anger and its variations. Philosopher and podcaster Maisha Cherry writes that there is, quote, an intrinsic and instrumental value of anger in response to oppression, end quote. Drawing from the tradition of feminist philosophy and more recent works by journalists and activists within the #MeToo movement, she states that rage as a response to sexist oppression is, quote, a form of protest that may help women retain their self-respect, gain insight into their oppression, and bear witness to that oppression. It is also a way to claim one's love for good and one's hatred for evil, end quote. In the face of racial oppression, Cherry says that anger plays the role of expressing the value of people of color and racial justice. It provides the eagerness, optimism, and self-belief needed to fight against persistent and powerful racist people and systems. And it allows the outraged to break certain racial rules as a form of intrinsic and extrinsic resistance. This helps to explain how the oppressed can feel affirmed when others get angry on their behalf, how people are able to fight against powerful systems despite risk of abuse and arrest, and why many athletes use their platform to combat racism. And when they do, they are viewed as radical, simply for expressing their feelings. In other words, certain forms of rage against racism are not inherently violent or negative. A particular variant, one she calls Lordian rage, inspired by the writing of Audre Lorde, can lead to positive action. I think it's important for those of us working in creative spaces like art classrooms to reflect on the emotional range that is invited into our spaces. Sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild called this emotional range feeling rules. Feeling rules are implicit guides and guidelines for the assessment of fits and misfits between feeling and situation. In other words, specific feelings and the emotional vocabularies that are assigned to different circumstances will delimit the possible scope of what is socially permissible in any given context. So what are the feeling rules of most art classrooms? Does anger lie within or outside the boundary of feeling? For most young people who are outraged and angry at racism, is the art classroom a safe space for feeling and expressing their rage at injustice? Writing about her own children, Audre Lorde suggests there is a responsibility educators have to protect the right of people who are in their care and the right to define themselves for themselves, to feel their own feelings. She says, quote, in order to do this kind of teaching, she and her partner, had to give their own children access to information from which to form those self-definitions. True information, no matter how uncomfortable it might be for us. We also had to provide them with sufficient space within which to feel anger, fear, rebellion, and joy, end quote. The prevailing ideology of art for the sake of fun suggests to me that happiness, not anger, is the implicit expectation in many art classrooms and art in school more generally. It is the feeling rule. And this rule does its own kind of harm. Like colorblind ideology, a barrier to addressing racism and other forms of social injustice creatively and artistically. I see it as denying children, all children, but especially children from historically oppressed and vulnerable groups, whose anger at injustice is often seen as a threat to civility, I believe it denies them the right to define themselves and the right to creatively and positively speak their truth. I'm left wondering what relevance art for the sake of fun has to social justice. If it suppresses our humanity by anesthetizing our full range of human emotions. Instead of don't worry, be happy, I'd like to endorse joy as a part of justice, and therefore a more useful framing for creative activity. The existing work in psychology on joy is relatively small and often disjointed. And maybe this is why joy is rarely discussed in educational thought, whereas other psychological concepts like intelligence and creativity hold a more prominent place in educational lexicon. It often actually, with intelligence in particular, frames how much of learning and learning outcomes are understood and then measured. I'm not going to rehearse the research on joy, but I will offer some basic definitions and dimensions of joy that guide my own thinking. They are based in large part on Matthew Quan Johnson's recent literature review in the Journal of Positive Psychology, published just last year, which drew from scholarly writings from diverse fields of theology and religious studies, philosophy, and literature. Joy can be defined as involving a state of positive affect in which one experiences feelings of freedom, safety, and ease. Joy is thought to be adaptive, and that repeated experiences of joy can encourage continued effort, particularly when progress toward the goal, whatever that goal might be, gets more difficult. Moreover, Johnson states, joy attunes us to being open to new possibilities for relating to our circumstances and perceiving them in a new light. In this sense, joy increases people's resources for survival. So what does joy feel like? Well, Johnson identifies several phenomenological qualities of joy. Joy can be excited or serene. Excited joy is really intense and high energy, whereas serene joy is calmer and feels more harmonious. There is joy that is individuated or affiliative. Individuated joy, as you might imagine, is experienced by oneself, and affiliative joy is shared with other people. Joy can also be felt as anticipatory or consummatory. Anticipatory joy is experienced when nearing the fulfillment or completion of something that a person really desires, and consummatory joy is felt when the desire has been fulfilled. Now, these are abstract ideas about joy. When joy is brought into conversation with practices in human rights and social justice, we can see that joy, like rage and anger, is an intensity tool that increases motivation in the fight against injustice. The adaptive qualities of joy make it a source of strength in the struggle to creatively work toward more just futures. Joy is also that which we are struggling to preserve. I'm certainly not the first to endorse joy as a part of creative activity and the practice of human rights. Marches during the civil rights movement were full of freedom songs. ACT UP was skilled in drawing on a range of feeling, from rage to love to humor and joy, using signs, posters, banners, and other graphic arts. There are more recent expressions of what Carla Bergman and Nick Montgomery called joyful militancy. Here, we're looking at a screenshot of performance activism in the Americas. In this particular work called Besaton por la Educación, what we see is the power of creative activity when it includes joy as a part of justice. What we're looking at, the besaton, is a kiss-in staged by students from the University of Santiago in Chile back in 2019. There were about 4,000 students gathered in the Plaza de Armas, and their faces and signs were painted with statements like enamorado pero endeudado. Pardon my poor Spanish, but it translates in English to in love but in debt, or con pasión para la educación, with passion for education. And what they are doing is kissing. They're standing there in this very large crowd, more than 4,000 of them, kissing for 1,800 seconds to publicize how much money, $1.8 billion, it would take to finance the tuition of higher education for all Chileans. The performance of protests are enlivened with joy, with movement, and with color. It is joy married to righteous rage that motivates and sustains the difficult, labor-intensive work of protests. The trauma-centered narrative of Black struggle that we've heard a lot about in the last several years has created its own kind of exhaustion. This exhaustion has given rise to what's being called Black joy, an alternative movement in which Black people reclaim the fullness of their humanity. As African-American studies scholar May Long Maloney explains, quote, Black joy is an act of resistance. The whole idea of oppression is to keep people down. So when people continue to shine and live fully, it is resistance in the context of our white supremacist world, end quote. In this slide, upset homegirls of Fullerton, California are shown at a Black Lives Matter protest. The group is an activist organization in Orange County, California. And as protesters marched and held up signs, the Uptown Homegirls invited the community to dance with them in front of City Hall, along with music that was curated for this particular performance. One of the group's members, Esther Fagbamila, explained to a local reporter, quote, I can't let myself stay in the position of victimhood or believe that I am in any way, shape, or form a victim to my circumstances. I can believe that I can be full of joy, still able to fight against my oppressors, end quote. So these are depictions of creating joy in hardship. Here, joy is subversive, an affective refusal, enlivened and enacted through bodies engaged in dance, song, mark making, and theatrics. It helps us in the fight while keeping us from losing our humanity. And when creative activity is collaborative, the joy extends beyond the individual to become expansive. Working in solidarity with women's activist groups, Audre Lorde reflects on this expansiveness of affiliative joy. She says, we can grow in tremendous courage from these women, from their laughter and their tears, from their grace under constant adversity, from their joy in living, which is one of their most potent weapons, from the deft power of their large, overworked bodies and their dancing, swollen feet. You can tell I'm a fan of Audre Lorde. If joy is one of our most potent weapons, and creative activity is a source of joy, then creative activity is inherently a threat to the status quo of injustice. With this in mind, I want to offer one final note on joy and bring it back to education and art in schools. It seems to me that joy is not only a reservoir of strength in the struggle for justice, it is also fundamental to well-being and human flourishing. It is part of what constitutes the good life. I have spent a lot of time with my research partner, Joni Acuff, thinking about ways to preserve and sustain the capacity for joy. And one way we are doing this in our own teaching and in our writing, in our most recent book, Race and Art Education, is to teach students about racial iconography, stereotype, and racial tropes. This tends to go against what we see in most K through 12 art settings, where there's an avoidance of imagery that's potentially hurtful, right? We censor it out. Yet, Joni and I also recognize that this puts students in harm's way by ignoring the reality, the empirical reality of their lives, much of which is lived online, where white supremacists, trolls, lurk and issue violent, vile, racist content. And that is abundant. So our approach has been different. We have been thinking about visual racial literacy as a necessary set of tools to preserve joy. We define visual racial literacy as the ability to recognize, to decode, critically interpret, and creatively respond to racist images and practices of looking. We see it as a human right, like other forms of literacy. And it is aimed at enhancing capacity to recognize expressions of negative creativity and to resist reinscription of oppressive representations in our students' own creative pursuits. Without visual racial literacy, there is a high likelihood that they will, in fact, not be able to interpret many of the images that they see, and that they will participate unknowingly, unintentionally in reproducing harmful representations in their own work. Joni and I teach visual racial literacy to our very young children as well. And we teach it to pre-service art teachers who will be sent out into the nation's schools to support the development of an increasingly racially and culturally diverse student population. But this is just one emergent strategy for scholars, teachers, and activists interested in justice, critical pedagogy, or any transformative practices to rise and reclaim joy and agency in troubled times. Adrienne Marie Brown defines emergent strategy as how we intentionally change in ways that grow our capacity to embody the just and liberated worlds we long for. Emergent strategies may be intentionally diverse, but they are all oriented toward preserving joy and striving for justice. They work on different scales and on different intensities, and some demand joyful militancy against overt white nationalists, neo-fascists, and alt-right groups, whereas other strategies will offer more studious forms of engagement. The point is that in the fight for joy, there is no one-size-fits-all strategy. There are multiple intersecting and networked strategies, some big and some small, some short-term and some long-term, that can, when viewed together, help restore a sense of wholeness and well-being. I'd like to close with one last story. As I've said, social justice is about making the good life more inclusive in its meaning and more evenly distributed. In June of 2020, after the great pivot and the school year had come to an end, I received an email from out of the blue. It was from a former student named Joseph. I had not seen or heard from Joseph since 2018. And this is what he wrote to me. Thank you for the impactful conversations that opened my mind to race in the classroom. With COVID-19, it shed a new light on race, poverty, and access. All educators, we had to go online. I had to ask the diverse and lower income families to meet with me online, and it wasn't fair because many of the families I serve immediately faced financial challenges, technology, and access barriers. Many elementary art educators saw very few submissions of work in general. And probably because parents and families had to make decisions about which assignments come first. And unfortunately, arts had to be last on the list when families were overloaded with general classroom work. But I noticed that I wasn't receiving anything from my diverse students, especially those whose families were immediately impacted by the shutdown. From what I gathered, the biggest barrier was the access to supplies. I remember getting a sweet message from one elementary student in my email. "I have no paper. Please send paper to my house through mail." There was something resonating in that. And Joseph goes on to talk about what he did in this instance. He says, "I want to bridge access. I created a GoFundMe, totally rogue from the school district, and I'll link it to you." He links it in the email. "I'm so grateful the community saw what was happening and how chaos was shedding light on barriers that have always been there in the community. We were totally funded through the GoFundMe and actually received more than what I had asked for in less than 24 hours. I got so much support. My plan is to create quality art kits for kids in the district. I want to give them out through shelters, one of which serves many LGBT children escaping family shaming, and also give them out in libraries and apartment complexes." I don't know about you, but I hear joy in Joseph's words. He was clearly motivated by the inequities he saw. He didn't have to do anything, but he did. And I think his experience of joy in the hard work of organizing and intervention fueled his activism through the summer and propelled him into doing more. I'll conclude by saying joy, as well as range and the full range of human emotion, has a rightful place in the struggle against microaggressions, as well as macro injustices. I hope we might entertain notions of joy in our conversations about justice and human rights throughout this day of conversation and beyond. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Amy. And I'm going to take a moment to respond and also to feed you some of the questions that have been generated by your profound explication about these matters. And I want to say, first of all, I know how the hurdles with regard to you being able to present today, given the circumstances that you're dealing with, and so I give you even more of a thanks than folks even realize. And yes, I see in my chat, bravo. Yeah. And I want to say, we have about 15 minutes for Q&A before we'll have a break, and I'll announce that to the audience. And thank you all for staying. There's some excellent questions. I'll state first of all that I was really moved when I read Tyson Lewis's quote that you posted about the physical effect of the attacks on his body. And for that reason, I'm just going to post in the chat. I'm going to take the liberty of posting in the chat. I had a similar experience to being attacked as a teenager, and written about it recently. It also shared this notion of how it physically affects you. And so I was just posting in the chat a story called "Skin" that sort of echoes Tyson Lewis's comments. And so thank you for all that. And to go into your questions now, you quoted Matthew Quan Johnson in terms of his definition of joy as an adaptive state of positive affect, where one experiences feelings of freedom, safety, and ease, increasing essentially our resources for survival. I'm gonna assume even for thriving, right? And so, in light of that, I want to ask you a question that came from the audience. I'm just scrolling up to it if I can find it. Let's see here. Yes. One of the audience questions asks for your opinion on the intersection of arts education and social emotional learning in the context of the things that you've read, that you've spoken about regarding the resources that A Pursuit of Joy lends to an individual. So if you can discuss that a little bit or talk about it. And we have a few questions, so you can keep your comments as brief as you can so we can maximize the time. So if you can.
Yeah, this question, I have thought about this before because it's come up before. And I would say, I do not read deeply. I should say that first. I do not read deeply in the social and emotional learning literature. I do know enough to know there are some critiques, and they're equity-oriented critiques of that literature, largely around the desire to contain and to manage feelings. And so I, in my remarks, have intentionally tried to steer clear of that literature, and really being inspired more than might make sense on the surface, very inspired by Maisha Cherry's work, her book, The Case for Rage. It might sound strange to sort of be thinking more deeply about joy after reading about rage, but I think they are interwoven in the context of human rights struggles and social justice and preserving one's humanity while working toward creating a better world that we may or may not see in our lifetime. So I just put that out there to say there's a little bit of literature that takes a sort of a healthy critical look at social and emotional learning literature. And I understand that classroom teachers are being mandated to roll out curricula that is informed by those frameworks, when perhaps we need to take a step back and reassess from some of that.
Yeah, thank you. I have questions myself, but I'm going to focus for the moment on the audience questions to give them time, some air time. I can always ask you my question. We'll have a conversation. So another question from the audience is, one audience member thanks you for the Audre Lorde quote and the many extensive quotes and the context. Question is, what do you think needs to happen on a large scale to transform our traditional art-making classrooms and spaces into spaces that allow for a full spectrum of emotional safeness? And what are the barriers that you see for that more urgent kind of change?
That is a fantastic question and deserving of a whole panel and symposium unto itself. My experience and my study of art classrooms, I taught in art classrooms and often long to go back and teach at the elementary setting. But there is a culture within art education that I kind of talk about in terms of our tendency to orient our lessons, our curricula toward what's fun, toward what we like and toward what's fun. And that just doesn't allow space for, within the feeling rules, it does not allow space for maybe working through some difficult feelings when we come into the classroom. At the same time, I recognize that there are real institutional challenges to trying to go deep in an art classroom when the time frame given for art classes, for example, is often 50 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. I also think one of the challenges is our oftentimes our orientation is toward making and making before doing a lot of thinking and ideation and exploration of feeling and that sort of thing. The drive to make a lot of things that can then be taken home and shared or put into a portfolio and put on the walls in the art classroom. I think that poses a significant challenge to doing not just work that has a sort of deep emotional resonance, for students. I mean, they don't have time to feel. We're often putting materials in front of them and asking them to manipulate with those materials without much context. But it's also a problem when just trying to, avoid things like misappropriation. The drive to make doesn't give us the time we need to really understand different aesthetic frames and the cultural context of what we're looking at. So there's a rush to make and a rush to have fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So making the rush to make stuff versus to make meaning, which informs that stuff, so to speak. Which might mean slowing down a bit, or slowing down in sometimes. So another question that I have for you, Amy, from the audience is someone thanking you for your encouragement about joy in our creative process. Reading the question, the comments, humans often get stuck. Would the speaker, would you see our role to each other to present joy by helping others? Do you see our role as to cultivate joy in one another as helping others to get unstuck? In other words, parents helping children to get unstuck, teachers helping students to get unstuck, employers helping employees to get unstuck. Please elaborate if you have any thoughts about that.
About getting stuck.
Getting unstuck.
Getting unstuck.
In the process towards joy.
Well, I don't know that we can sort of script for joy. Right. I don't know that that's possible. And quite frankly, there's a lot that I have yet to unearth about joy. I mean, I'm very interested in this because there's so much I don't know about it. And yet everything I'm seeing around me tells me we need to pay more attention to it. And the psychological literature has not, which helps me to understand why maybe educators have not taken up joy as a part of what they are called to support in classrooms with young people. Instead, we talk about rigor and sort of higher order thinking and things like that. But, in my experiences with my colleagues, with my children, I think we walk alongside one another. We listen to one another. We make and we dance and we walk with one another. We journey with one another. I don't think we get other people unstuck. I think there's something about that sort of networked creative possibility that that allows us to find those openings, right? The joy literature does talk about openings, which is a part of what I love about it, right? You find freedom, you find ease, and a certain kind of openness to possibility. So yeah, I know I'm not answering your question with clear answers, and it's absolutely because I am journeying myself to figure this out.
Indeed, and so are we all. I have another question here, which I think is really interesting. You mentioned racial battle fatigue as a harmful experience that is cumulative. Black joy was cited as an act of resistance. I think the author of the question asserts that Black joy acts as a counterstory to racial battle fatigue. Are there other methods that could act as a counter narrative to racial battle fatigue?
Well, I think Black joy is, I think of it, I know it's described as a movement, but I think it's a philosophy. It's like a refusal to be brought down, right? To let one's innermost self be subjugated, right? And there are plenty of examples of this in the world, in our own country, dating back at least 400 years. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think we need joy as a way to move forward. And I am very interested in dislodging it from notions of fun and happy. And I'm interested in hearing what folks will have to say a little bit later today on how they're working together in creative spaces and what kind of sensations, right? The sensations of being in those spaces together and creating together bring about, not just the stuff that we make together or the deeper insights, but the feeling that arises in those spaces of creative work.
Thank you. I think I have time for one more question, and I do thank you for all of the attention you're giving us, Amy. I will mention quickly that some folks are asking about a bibliography about your joy literature. Piqued some interest here, and so I don't know if that's something that you could share in some way later on, and maybe we'd be happy to disseminate that, I think, if we can. But the question that I have has to do with, you talked about joy as a weapon, and I was thinking about it as I'm assuming a weapon for of self-defense or self-actualization. And to my mind, I was wondering, is it a weapon or is it a tool? That's a part of the question. And the other part of the question is, do you have a sense, or can you make a connection between the idea of the pursuit of joy and the development of empathy in order to, as in the effort to create what you've called the good life, or do some of the world making that you were talking about?
So joy as a weapon. Weapons are tools. And joy could perhaps be used for things beyond the context in which I'm thinking of it, right? It can transcend the context of activism and racial justice. But in the context of struggles for human rights, it's absolutely a tool to sort of open up possibility, right? To leave open other worlds, better worlds, right? Without sort of a joy factor to lean into, we fall into despair.
Yes.
And that's a hard place to come out of, right? Maybe that's the getting stuck that's so hard to come out of. But it's also a weapon, right? It can absolutely be used defensively. And I think a lot of folks engaged in creative action as a part of protest movements are using it to, particularly in artistic forms, right? Artistic expressions of joy. They're using that to create a sense of community, right? That is itself a defense mechanism to being individuated and attacked at the level of sort of divide and conquer, right? So organizing, the arts are used as a joyful weapon in organizing and defending against brutality.
Yes.
Right. It's shocking to see a group marching and singing, and then for them to be brutalized.
Yes.
And that televised. I mean, that I think of that as a weaponry. So, and it does not harm the body, but it does strike at what I would call the soul or the spirit, that sort of that realm. Development of empathy, I think, is tricky. Because sometimes with empathy, I much prefer the term compassion, right? With empathy, I think there's a risk of sort of colonizing, if you will, colonizing someone else's experience by filtering it through one's own worldview.
I see.
And it becomes something else. So again, that walking alongside is much closer to compassion for me. And notions of the good life. I don't think we talk about that enough. Like what is the good life, and is our notion of the good life inclusive enough? Is it a broad enough vision where everyone can come in and everyone is included? And is it distributed? I think there are folks who enjoy the good life, but it's not very widely distributed.
Yes. So I'm going to thank you at this moment and put a cap on this, your wonderful keynote that has opened up a vision for your framing that I think is going to prompt a lot of thinking. And folks, like I said, are already looking for bibliography. I'm seeing comments, amazing opening session. A lot of wonderful comments in here if you get a chance to look at the chat before you have to step away. And I want to close this session, just for the sake of the audience, by noting that that as we go into our break, the event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel for those in the audience. This is a 15-minute break that we're going to have. We're going to come back at about 2:30. And our next panel will be Art as Social Response and Responsibility. And during the break, if you have a moment to view, there's going to be a curated selection of paintings and an audio recorded statement about the Refugee series by artist Audrey Frank Anastasi. So we invite you all to stay and turn your sound up or to view in the meantime. But once again, thank you, Amy, Dr. Cray. You're getting wonderful comments in the chat. And you've really kicked us off in a way that is provocative and, like I said, visionary. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much.